The Alberta oil sands sector has $31 billion of liabilities, environmental liabilities. And that includes 37 tailings ponds with 1.4 trillion with a T liters of toxic tailings. Now, you would think that the industry would and the government would be eager to get that cleaned up, but in fact, it seems like exactly the opposite is the case, because the government has just introduced legislation to make it easier for the governments to not pay into a reclamation fund when times are tough. So we're going to talk to Nina Lothian from the Pembina Institute about that. Welcome to the interview, Nina.
Hi, Markham. Thanks for having me.
Look, why don't you tell us about the legislation that the government has introduced?
Sure. There's two changes that the government of Alberta announced last Thursday, May 6th, I believe, around the mine financial security program. The first one was to make an adjustment to reflect in their perception a rough oil price year in 2020. So normally operators would pay into this mine financial security based on a ratio of their assets to liability. And so their assets went down because the price of oil went down. And the government is essentially waiving that requirement in an interim basis, they are saying. The second change that they announced was an overview of the full mine financial security program. The details remain to be shared, but it sounds like they're going to include some engagement with Indigenous communities and other stakeholders in this review. And it's also in response to an Auditor General report dating back as far as 2015 that did some research and argued that the mine financial security program wasn't actually meeting its objective of protecting Albertans from shouldering the risk associated with the environmental impacts of oil sand mines.
Here's the problem that I have with this, Nina. Let's say that the oil sands companies were paying into these funds regularly. So instead, they have less than $1 billion in there now, and that number is not growing much at all. But here's the problem. In 2019, when the oil sands had record free cash flow, what did they do with that money? They gave it all back to shareholders. So when times are good, they don't look after these liabilities that they have. They give it back to shareholders, or they spend it somewhere else. And then when times are bad, they ask for a reprieve from paying again into the fund against their liabilities. Mm-hmm. If they, when times are good and they have cash flow, and they said, okay, now we're going to make up for what we had, maybe we cut back when the oil prices were down, I might be more sympathetic. But it's pretty hard given the current circumstances.
Yeah, and it's frightening in a way, because the future is very uncertain about the demand for oil as the world takes action on climate change. And so I think we are very ill prepared for a very tough future for this industry. And unfortunately, as you said, there's $30 billion worth of liability, and that's based on industry estimates. There have been other estimates that show it's significantly more than that. And Albertans essentially have less than $1 billion, so less than 3% held in security to protect us against the risk of having to pay that cleanup.
Now, I understand that the orphan wells problem is apples and oranges compared to this problem, but the principle remains the same. For decades and decades, the regulator and the government kicked the can down the road in terms of environmental liabilities. And then when things got really bad for the junior oil sector, it came back to bite them. Mm-hmm. And so right now we could say, oh, well, it's no problem. The oil sands companies are all financially healthy. They have good, solid balance sheets. Things don't look too bad, but things can turn around in fairly quickly. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is the danger here, is the unforeseen. We're not putting money away for that rainy day that will probably come.
Absolutely. I mean, 2020 is the perfect example of that, right? Where we saw the price of oil go negative. No one could predict that. And so we have an opportunity. I think the first quarter of 2021 has been quite lucrative for the oil sands sector. So we do have an opportunity to manage this risk better in Alberta. So, I mean, part of me, I'm a little skeptical, but I'm hopeful that as we review the program, as the government takes this review, and starts this process, that we actually think more carefully about how we protect against the potential that some of these oil sand operators are not around and and don't have the funds to pay for the full cleanup. And so one thing that Pembina has argued for, and there's others within the Alberta community, is full security. And there's the example, the coal sector, who is also under this mine financial security program, has chosen to post full security. So, which means the government of Alberta holds in trust the equivalent cost that they've estimated to clean up the coal mines. We think the same thing should apply for the oil sands sector. I don't think it can come in one fell swoop. We understand that that has a cost implication to an operator, but there's a way to bring it in increments over a period of time, so that that we have that money in the bank in case of a rainy day.
Now here's, okay, so we've identified a couple of risk factors. The liabilities are $31 billion. There's less than $1 billion in the bank to cover them. We've identified the energy transition, peak oil demand, potential decline in consumption affecting their bottom line as another risk factor. Well, here's the third, and that is that the technology to reclaim oil sands tailings ponds, for instance, is not there yet. And industry and researchers have been grappling with this for years and years and years, and they still do not have a satisfactory way to reclaim those ponds. So it's not out of the realm of question. You can look down the road and say, oh my goodness, we've had something unforeseen happen. Now what do we do? We don't even know how to fix these things.
Absolutely. I mean, I 100% agree that we haven't figured out tailings treatment, and that, as you said off the top, 1.4 trillion liters represents a huge risk environmentally and economically. But one other thing about the full security is that actually would incent industry to reduce the liability, because the lower your liability, the less money that you would have to post in security. And I think we haven't had the mechanisms in Alberta to drive much more aggressive cleanup. And so this problem continues to grow, and we haven't, I'm not saying we haven't invested money, we've invested significant money in trying to sort out tailings, but we need to do a lot more research. We need to do a lot more testing. We need to just get out there and put a lot more effort into this. And full security would be a great incentive, because it would, you would get money back if you reduced your liability. You wouldn't have so much held up in security from a company perspective.
Well, I'm a little skeptical about that's going to happen, because I have argued editorially that in order for the oil sands to continue a long term, that it has to do at a minimum a couple of things. One of them, of course, is to bring down its really, really high greenhouse gas emissions. It's 10 to 11% of the Canadian national emissions total. So it has to do that quicker, and there doesn't seem to be the will in the industry to do that. And it also has to lower its liability issue. It has to grapple with that liability issue. And until it does, I think the oil sands is setting itself up for a serious problem here that will affect its long-term future, because it hasn't, as markets shift and public sentiment shifts with it, they're not going to be prepared for it. And this is the proverbial super tanker that does not turn on a dime.
No, absolutely.
Anyway, I'm glad you agree with. Anyway, thank you very much for this. Any final thoughts, Nina?
I guess one final thing that we would say is timelines. And this is, again, trying to move this super tanker, is this sector in Alberta, we don't have timelines for cleanup, and other jurisdictions definitely do. And I think that also is a missing piece in this mine financial security program.
Good point. Thank you very much for your insights. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Markham.